Harlem. No sirens, no arrests, no confrontation unfolding in public view. What happened that day didn't look like a story anyone would bother to remember, at least not at first. A little girl stepped forward in a crowded space and approached Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't threatening, and it wasn't supposed to matter. People nearby barely reacted. In a city full of noise, moments like that disappear all the time. But this one didn't, because of what happened next. Not violence, not intimidation. A decision, calm, deliberate, and unmistakable. Something Bumpy chose to do, knowing exactly who might be watching and what it would signal if he didn't. Within days, the story traveled, not through newspapers but through police channels. It appeared in briefings, it was mentioned in reports, desk to desk, precinct to precinct. The same detail repeated every time without embellishment. He handled it the right way. That was the problem. Law enforcement is built to respond to crimes, not to moments that redraw moral boundaries in public. There was no charge to file, no violation to cite. Yet the incident couldn't be ignored because it did something more disruptive than breaking the law. It set a standard. When a figure like Bumpy Johnson is seen enforcing a boundary that even police rely on, the balance shifts. Authority doesn't vanish, but it has to recalibrate, and that recalibration leaves a paper trail even when no crime has occurred. 1951 became one of those years remembered not for what went wrong, but for what went unexpectedly right. And why that unsettled an entire system? Because sometimes the smallest act carries farther than any act of violence ever could. And that's how a moment involving a little girl ended up reaching every police desk in New York. In Harlem's underworld, there were lines everyone understood without needing them written down. One of the clearest involved children, not because of law, but because of norms. When a child entered the space around power, behavior was supposed to slow, soften, and reveal what kind of authority was really being exercised. That's why the moment in 1951 mattered the instant the little girl stepped forward. She didn't represent leverage. She didn't bring risk or opportunity. She brought visibility. And visibility changes incentives. For someone like Bumpy Johnson, the presence of a child forced a decision that couldn't be postponed or delegated. Whatever he did would be read immediately, not as strategy, but as character. Most power collapses under that kind of scrutiny. In criminal spaces, people are used to being watched by rivals or police. They are not used to being watched by innocents. A child doesn't negotiate. She doesn't fear reputation. She doesn't understand hierarchy. Her presence strips away performance and leaves only action. That's why everyone nearby paid attention, even if they pretended not to. Bumpy understood the stakes instantly. This wasn't about generosity or image. It was about setting a boundary that would be remembered. Children are the one audience that turns private codes into public standards. If he mishandled the moment, it wouldn't just damage his standing. It would invite a different kind of attention, one law enforcement never ignores. Because once a child is involved, everything becomes simpler for police. Motive doesn't matter. Context doesn't matter. Only outcome does. That's why what Bumpy chose to do mattered more than what he could have done. He didn't perform kindness. He didn't make a show. He acted in a way that closed the situation cleanly, publicly, and without ambiguity. No one had to interpret it. No one had to explain it later. The boundary was clear, and that clarity traveled. People who saw it understood immediately that something had been established. Not a favor, not an exception. A line. One that wasn't negotiable and didn't need reinforcement. In neighborhoods like Harlem, those lines last longer than threats, because they are shared. Everyone knows where they are, and everyone knows the cost of crossing them. The presence of a child turned an ordinary interaction into a test of moral authority. And moral authority, once displayed publicly, is harder for systems to dismiss than force. That's why the incident didn't stay local. It didn't need drama to spread. It carried its own weight. By the time police heard about it, the story wasn't about a man and a child anymore. It was about what happens when power chooses restraint in a space where restraint isn't required, and what that choice reveals about who really controls the boundaries everyone else depends on. What followed wasn't an act the police could charge. There was no exchange that violated the law, no instruction that crossed a line, no visible abuse of influence. In fact, from a strictly legal standpoint, nothing happened. And that was exactly what made the incident so difficult to ignore. Law enforcement is trained to respond to violations, not to restraint. Reports are written when something goes wrong, not when someone chooses not to exploit a moment. Yet this was a case where the absence of wrongdoing created more discussion than a minor offense ever would have. Officers who heard about it didn't ask what law had been broken. They asked something else entirely. Why did this moment feel important enough to remember? The answer was precedent. In public spaces, especially ones already under scrutiny, behavior creates expectations. When a figure known for power responds to a child in a way that shuts down risk completely, without spectacle, without benefit, without reward, it sends a signal that can't be dismissed as coincidence. It establishes a rule that others will follow, not because they're ordered to, but because deviating from it suddenly looks unacceptable. Police recognized that immediately, not as a threat, but as a complication. If the story had involved intimidation, it would have fit a familiar pattern. If it had involved generosity with strings attached, it would have raised obvious red flags. But this was neither. It was clean, boring even. And boring is dangerous for enforcement, because boring moments reshape environments quietly. The problem wasn't that the act challenged the law. The problem was that it aligned with it in a way the law couldn't claim ownership over. It reinforced a boundary officers themselves relied on, that children remain off limits, no matter who holds power. When that boundary is upheld voluntarily by someone outside the system, it blurs the line between informal authority and formal control. That's why the incident didn't stay anecdotal. It moved into reports not as evidence, but as context. Officers mentioned it because it explained behavior elsewhere. It helped make sense of why certain situations de-escalated on their own, why people backed off without being told, why a particular space suddenly felt regulated without police intervention. Nothing illegal had occurred, but something structural had. The act created a reference point. From that moment on, anyone crossing that line wouldn't just be violating an unwritten code. They'd be contradicting a standard that had already been demonstrated publicly. And once a standard is demonstrated, enforcement changes. It becomes selective. It becomes strategic. It becomes more cautious. That's why the moment mattered. Not because it showed power being used, but because it showed power choosing not to be used, and still achieving an outcome the law itself would have wanted, without needing to step in. No newspaper picked it up. No headline summarized it. Yet within days, the same brief account surfaced across precincts, not as rumor, but as shared understanding. An officer mentioned it during a shift change. Another noted it in a routine briefing. The story moved the way operational knowledge does, quietly, efficiently, without embellishment. What made it travel wasn't drama, it was clarity. Each retelling emphasized the same point. There were no added details, no exaggerations, just the outcome. How Bumpy Johnson handled the situation, and how cleanly it ended. That consistency gave the story credibility. Officers didn't repeat it to impress anyone. They repeated it because it explained things they were already seeing on the street. Police culture is pragmatic. Information spreads when it helps people predict behavior. This story did exactly that. It suggested that a boundary had been publicly affirmed, one that would likely be enforced socially before police ever needed to get involved. For officers working Harlem, that mattered. It meant fewer unknowns, fewer sudden escalations around children, fewer situations that could spiral into something irreversible. So the incident became shorthand. Not the time a girl approached him, but that moment in 51. A reference point that helped officers assess risk without asking questions out loud. When a story reaches that status, it's no longer anecdotal, it's operational context. It changes how people position themselves, where they stand, when they intervene, and when they don't. The speed of the spread surprised even veterans. Usually, only violence or arrests move that fast through the system. This didn't fit either category. It was a non-event that created fewer events afterward, and that, paradoxically, made it more valuable to share. It suggested a stabilizing force the department hadn't created, but now had to account for. By the end of the week, the story had reached desks far from the original block. Not because someone pushed it upward, but because each layer found it useful and passed it along. Supervisors didn't dismiss it. They logged it mentally. Analysts didn't cite it. They factored it in. That's how influence spreads when it doesn't break rules. It slips past filters designed to catch violations and embeds itself as expectation. The law didn't react to the incident. The law adapted around it. And once that happens, a moment no one expected to matter becomes something everyone quietly plans for. Law enforcement didn't react to the incident because it demanded action. They reacted because it removed options. When a boundary is enforced publicly without police involvement, it changes how authority is distributed in that space. Officers understood that immediately, and it unsettled them more than an outright violation ever would. If the moment had gone wrong, the response would have been straightforward. Charges, reports, presence, control would remain clearly in the hands of the state. But this moment did the opposite. It resolved itself cleanly, in full view, and according to a standard officers themselves relied on, without requiring them to step in. That's the problem. When informal authority enforces the same limits as formal authority, the line between who is regulating behavior becomes blurred. Police don't lose power in that scenario, but they lose exclusivity. And exclusivity is what keeps systems simple. Once it's gone, every decision requires more judgment, more context, more caution. Supervisors couldn't dismiss the story because it explained outcomes they couldn't otherwise account for. Fewer complaints, fewer tense encounters involving children, fewer situations escalating past the point of no return. The incident functioned like an invisible buffer, one the department hadn't created, but now benefited from. Ignoring it would have been irresponsible. That's why the story was discussed, noted, and quietly absorbed into how officers thought about the area. Not as praise, not as endorsement, as reality. Acknowledging it didn't mean accepting informal power. It meant adjusting to an environment where certain limits were already being respected without enforcement. The deeper concern was precedent. If a figure like Bumpy Johnson could publicly demonstrate restraint in a way that stabilized behavior, it complicated the usual narrative. It forced officers to consider that intervention wasn't always the mechanism maintaining order. Sometimes order pre-existed their arrival. That doesn't sit comfortably in any bureaucracy. So the incident lingered. It stayed in conversation because it represented a category law enforcement is never fully prepared for. Moments that align with the law so precisely that they displace the need for it, even temporarily. Those moments don't threaten authority outright. They quietly reframe it, and reframing is harder to counter than confrontation. That's why police couldn't ignore what happened in 1951, not because it broke rules, but because it reinforced them in a way that forced the system to acknowledge a boundary it didn't set, but now had to respect. What made the incident last wasn't the moment itself. It was what never happened afterward. No one tested the boundary that had been drawn. Not rivals, not opportunists, not people looking to provoke a response. The line held, precisely because it had been drawn in a way that didn't require reinforcement. That's the difference between a rule and a limit. Rules need enforcement. Limits need recognition. What Bumpy Johnson established in 1951 wasn't a directive. It was a reference point. Everyone who heard about it understood the implication immediately. This was not an exception. It was a standard. And standards are harder to challenge than threats, because violating them doesn't just invite retaliation. It invites universal disapproval. After that moment, behavior adjusted preemptively. People didn't wait to see what would happen if they crossed the line. They assumed the outcome and avoided it. That assumption is where real control lives. When consequences are understood without being demonstrated, power becomes efficient. Police noticed the effect quickly. Certain situations stopped escalating. Certain complaints stopped appearing. The absence wasn't dramatic, but it was measurable. And because it was measurable, it mattered. It told law enforcement that a boundary had been socially enforced in a way the system itself rarely achieved without visibility or force. No memos went out. No policies changed, but patrol behavior adjusted. Officers became more confident about where lines were likely to hold. They approached situations differently, knowing escalation was less likely around that boundary. The moment from 1951 had quietly altered the operating assumptions on both sides of the law. This is the part most people misunderstand about power. It doesn't always expand by taking space. Sometimes it expands by removing uncertainty, by making it clear what will not be tolerated even when no one is watching. The line drawn that day didn't belong to the police. It didn't belong to the street. It belonged to a shared understanding that neither side wanted violated. And once a limit reaches that status, it becomes untouchable. Not because it's protected by force, but because crossing it isolates you instantly. In systems built on reputation and memory, isolation is more dangerous than punishment. That's why the story endured. Not because of what happened, but because of what never did afterward. The silence around that boundary was the proof that it had been accepted, by the community, by rivals, and by law enforcement alike. And once accepted, it didn't need to be spoken again. The moment in 1951 didn't end with applause, arrests, or headlines. It ended with agreement. A quiet, shared understanding that a line had been drawn, and that crossing it would isolate whoever tried. That's why the story traveled so far, so fast, and so cleanly through police channels. Bumpy Johnson didn't assert power that day. He defined a limit, and limits endure longer than displays of force because they don't require repetition. Once recognized, they regulate behavior on their own. The law didn't lose authority because of it, but it had to adapt to an environment where a crucial boundary was already being respected without intervention. For officers, that mattered. It changed expectations. It reduced uncertainty. It explained why certain situations de-escalated before they arrived. And when an outcome aligns perfectly with what enforcement wants, without enforcement acting, it becomes impossible to ignore. That's why the incident didn't disappear into rumor. It became context, a reference point, something supervisors and patrol officers quietly carried with them as they made decisions on the street. Not because it broke the rules, but because it reinforced them in a way the system couldn't claim credit for. This is the lesson of 1951. Power doesn't always announce itself by taking control. Sometimes it announces itself by refusing to cross a line, and making sure everyone else understands that refusal is permanent. No charges were filed, no speeches were made, yet a boundary was set that reached every police desk in New York. And once a boundary reaches that level of recognition, it stops being a moment. It becomes part of how a city operates, quietly, consistently, and without needing to be enforced again.